You're listening to The Reclaimed Life, a podcast about recognizing manipulation, reclaiming your voice, and rebuilding a life that actually feels like your own. I'm Rachel Paxton, an author, ordained chaplain, and certified mental health coach. And each week, I'll explore the patterns, dynamics, and turning points that help people rediscover who they truly are. Sometimes the hardest part of healing is not what happened, it's accepting what it means. Accepting that someone may not become who you hoped they would be. Accepting that the person you wanted may not be the person standing in front of you. Accepting that potential and reality are not the same thing. In today's episode, we're talking about the grief of accepting who someone really is, and why letting go of who we hoped they would become can be one of the most painful parts of healing. I think that many people sometimes spend years grieving the wrong thing. They think they're grieving the end of a relationship, or the loss of a friendship, or a betrayal, or a disappointment. But often what they're actually grieving is the gap between who someone is and who they hoped they would be. Because hope is powerful. Hope allows us to stay. Hope allows us to wait. Hope allows us to believe that things can change. And sometimes they do. People can grow. People can heal. People can become more self-aware. People can take responsibility. People can change. But not everyone does. And eventually, there comes a moment when we have to decide, am I relating to who this person is or who I hope they will become? And that is a painful question, because potential can be beautiful. Potential can keep us connected long after reality is asking us to pay attention. Potential can make us overlook patterns, ignore inconsistencies, minimize concerns, explain away behavior, and hold on far longer than we otherwise would. Many people are not attached to who someone is. They are attached to glimpses, moments, promises, possibilities, the occasional version of that person that appears just long enough to keep hope alive. But when those moments are mixed with disappointment, confusion, inconsistency, or hurt, it can become incredibly difficult to know what is real. One of the hardest realizations in healing is this: a person's potential is not their character. A person's intentions are not their actions. And a person's promises are not the same thing as their patterns. Patterns tell us far more than promises ever will. Sometimes people show us who they are over and over again, not because they sit us down and explain it, but because their behavior consistently tells the story, and sometimes we spend years arguing with the evidence because we want a different outcome. I think many of us have had moments where we thought, if they could just see it, if they could just understand, if they could just heal, if they could just be honest, then everything would change. But healing often begins when we stop building our lives around someone else's potential. Accepting who someone is does not mean condemning them, though. It does not mean labeling them. It does not mean deciding they will never grow. People surprise us all the time. People do change. People do heal. But acceptance means being honest about the version of them that exists today, not the version that might exist someday. Because decisions have to be made in reality. Boundaries have to be made in reality. Trust has to be built in reality. Relationships have to function in reality, not in possibility, not in potential, not someday. And there's grief in that, real grief, because sometimes accepting who someone really is means letting go of the future you imagined, the conversation you hoped would happen, the accountability you hoped would come, the relationship you hoped would exist, the person you hoped they would become. And that's heartbreaking because often the loss is invisible. Nobody sees what you're grieving. You aren't just grieving a person, you're grieving a possibility, a hope, a future that never arrived. But there's also freedom in acceptance, because acceptance allows us to stop fighting reality It allows us to stop carrying responsibility for another person's choices. It allows us to stop exhausting ourselves trying to create outcomes that belong to someone else. Acceptance is not giving up. Acceptance is beginning to see clearly. And sometimes seeing clearly is one of the most loving things we can do for ourselves. Maybe healing isn't learning how to make people become who we need them to be. Maybe healing is learning how to respond wisely to who they actually are. Maybe healing is grieving the difference. And maybe freedom begins when we stop waiting for reality to become something else and finally allow ourselves to see what's been there all along. Thank you for listening to The Reclaimed Life. If something in this episode resonated with you, you're not alone. Many people are beginning to recognize unhealthy patterns in relationships, systems, and environments, and discovering that reclaiming their voice is possible. In future episodes, I'll explore topics like recognizing manipulation, understanding narcissistic dynamics, rebuilding self-trust, and learning how to create a life that actually feels like your own. If you'd like to explore more of these ideas, you can visit my website at thereclaimedlifepodcast.com, where I share additional writing, resources, and future episodes of the show. Until next time, take a moment to listen to your intuition, trust what you're beginning to see, and remember that reclaiming your life often begins with one honest question. This is The Reclaimed Life.